Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and you don't really need Redux. In this video, we're going to learn how you can get a lot of the same benefits that you would get from Redux using two hooks that come with React, no additional packages or anything like that. Those two hooks are useContext and useReducer. This app we've got in front of us, it's got some filters, and I can change the stars and filter down these restaurants below, change the amount of money that it costs to eat there, or I can reset the filters to view the list. So this is made using this version, Redux version I have of this app. And I would say this video is for people that have a little bit of an idea or have worked with Redux before, but I'll try to give a quick overview of how it works. So at the top of this, I'm importing some libraries from the Redux package to create my Redux store where I'm going to store the state and produce new versions of it. And I've got a couple things that come from React Redux that allow me to pass that state to sort of any level of the component tree within my Redux store. So I started off with an initial state where I have a rating of 3 and a price of 1. That's why when I refresh the page, it starts at 3 and 1 here. And then I've got a number of actions that can take place that will be changing those values of state. So this all comes together in the reducer, and the reducer's main job is basically to take our current version of the state along with an action, and based on whatever type of action that is, to produce a new version of the state. So let's say we receive the action to set the rating. So we'll take a copy of our current state, update the rating with its new value, and return that to produce the new version. This all comes together in the create store where we give it our reducer, it produces a sort of store, and now we need to provide this store into our React app. So we do that using the provider component that receives the store as a prop, and what this provider does is it provides context, basically a way for any of the components within the provider to be able to grab values from our Redux state and to also dispatch events to our reducer that produce new versions of the state. So the components we have within this provider are connected filters and connected results. So let's start with filters. I've got filters right here. And the way it works is we're receiving a number of props, the rating, the current rating in our state, a function to change that to set a new rating, a price, a function to set that new price, and a reset function to set it back to where it began. So I won't go too much into this code. It's basically just looping over and displaying these filters here. It's creating 5 stars, 3 money bags, and a reset button. And for example, when you click the reset button, on click, it calls this reset function. So where does all of this data and functions come from? Well, it comes from this connected filters component that I created. So I created this using the connect function that comes with React Redux package. And connect basically gives you 2 ways to pass props into the component that you're connecting to your Redux store. It allows you to pass state in. So you give it a function that receives the state, and you can basically determine what parts of that state you want to make available as a prop to the function that you're sort of wrapping this around. And you also have a way to pass in functions that will dispatch. And what dispatching means is basically send this action to the reducer so that based on whatever type it is, it can produce a new version of the state. So what we're passing in here are 3 functions: set rating, set price, and reset. And these functions, at least the 2 set ones, they take in a value. And then we call dispatch, which will send an action, which is this whole thing here. So an action is comprised of a type so that our reducer knows sort of what action to receive to produce the new version of the state, and any additional data you want to give with it. So reset, it doesn't require any additional data, so it simply just dispatches an event. Not an event, an action. I always mix them up, but in my mind, they're sort of the same thing. So by passing filters to this connect function, we're basically passing the state and the dispatch functions as props into this component. So we do the same thing with results. In results, I want to know the current rating and the price so that I can filter out the restaurants that match. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking this data, filtering it, and only picking the ones that match the rating and the price that were set up. Then I loop through them and display them. And again, I had to connect this, and connecting it is again a way to pass the state and dispatch functions from your Redux store into those components. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to copy and paste this entire thing, and we're going to create a new file called version context. And we're going to produce the same sort of functionality without using Redux at all. So we'll come up to the top, and the first thing we can do is we can get rid of Redux and React Redux. They're not needed. A lot of it's going to look very similar though. We do have our initial state. We will have actions. We will have a reducer, except in our reducer here, we won't need to pass a default value to state. We'll do that elsewhere, which you'll see shortly. And we don't need a store because that doesn't exist in the way we're going to tackle it. So let's start with sort of the main function that gets exported from this file, or main function, main component in version context. We'll rename this so that it makes sense. Okay, so if you remember back to Redux, we wrapped a provider around our children, and the provider gave us a way to access the Redux store in any of the child components. It doesn't need to even be the first level, it could be 10 levels deep. It allows us to reach up and grab values from our Redux store. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to create our own provider here. So we won't need to pass a store to this provider, but we will need to create this provider. So we'll do that below. So we'll say it's a function provider. So now this is happy. We have the provider. And you can see here that provider receives these two children. So we will need to receive them as props, children. Okay, so what's going to go in this provider function? What we're going to do is we are going to create our own context and provider. And what context does, it basically allows you to take state from higher up in the component tree and access it a lot lower down without having to do prop drilling where you pass the state from component to component to component as props. You can basically just grab up as many levels and access the data from your context. So the first thing we need to do is actually create our context. So we will call this the restaurant context. And the way we create a context in React using no additional packages or anything like that is saying react.create context, like this. So if you don't like doing react.create context, you could always import create context here, but I'm just going to grab it right from React. Okay, so now that we have this context, we can use it inside of this provider component that we're creating. So what we'll want to do is return restaurant context.provider. And inside a provider, we are going to embed our children like this. So by doing this, we're basically giving our children a way to grab the value or the data from this provider, this context and provider that we're creating. So the next thing we are going to do is we can get rid of this whole idea of having to connect our filters and results components. Using hooks, there's a hook called use context. You don't need to sort of wrap them around. You can just use this hook to grab a value directly from your context. But what value will we be grabbing from our context? This is what we need to do next. So we are going to create a variable called value, which will start out as empty. And we need to pass this value as a prop to our restaurant context provider. So let's just give it a couple values. We'll say rating is 3 and what was it? Price or money? Price is 1. So for now, we're just hard coding it. We'll make it dynamic in a little bit, but we've created value. We've passed this value to our restaurant context provider, and because our children live within it, we'll be able to reach up and grab that from there. And just for now, because we need set rating, set price, and reset as well, let's create them. So set rating for now will just be an empty function. Set price will be the same thing. Oops, not semicolon. And reset will be also a function. So now we're basically setting up our context value to be exactly what we need it to have for our components to work that are sort of expecting to receive those things. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove this whole concept of connected. And with it, I'm going to delete all of this code here that connected our Redux store to our filters component. We can also remove this connected results. And we're left with just these two components, filters and results. So if you look at filters, filters wanted to receive these props: rating, set price, reset. We still want to receive the same things, but we're not going to receive it as props anymore. We can grab those values from our context. So the way you do that is you can say const, and then those same things are equal to React.useContext. So this allows us to grab data from a parent context, and the context we're grabbing this from is the restaurant context. So I'll pass that into the function here. So now filters should work because we're grabbing all of the data we needed from this context that's available to us because both filters and results have been nested within the provider that you can see here passed as children, and the children are embedded inside of our restaurant context provider component. And we'll go down and do the same thing for results. So results wanted to receive rating and price from our state. So we'll say const do equals react.useContext. And the context that we want to grab these values from is that same one, the restaurant context. All right, so we've been making a ton of code changes without even trying this code out. So let's hook it in. So inside the app, in this little demo app I have, I'm only using the version Redux now. So why don't we just duplicate this and we'll say we want the version context, and we'll place this in and we'll put our new one we're building at the top. So version context. So if we're to go back to this page, we can see that it's sort of working. It looks right. The Redux one being below and the context above. It's got the correct filters showing up. So let's change it. Oh, right. It doesn't do anything like the Redux one does because we haven't yet connected it correctly to our data. We hard-coded the data to be 3 and 1. So if I were to come back here and change this, say, to 2, now you can see it's 2 and it's filtering correctly, but we need to tie it in to the real data. And the way we're going to do that is by using another hook called useReducer, and that allows us to follow the same pattern that we're used to with Redux, where we have a reducer function that takes our old state and action and produces new state. And we'll use that and we'll say const state and dispatch. So these should look similar after reviewing our version Redux, where the state is the data within your store, or in this case there's no store but your state. And then dispatch is a way to basically trigger the reducer function being called to produce new versions of that state. So that will come from React.useReducer. And when you use useReducer, you can pass in what the initial state would be. So that's why I left this little variable up here that contains our initial state. So we can say React.useReducer with this initial state. And now I don't need to hard code rating and price here. I can actually grab that data from our state. So state.rating, and state.price. So it should still work. Cannot read property, rating of undefined. What did I do wrong? State. Maybe it's the opposite. Dispatch and state. No. Let's go back. Oh. Okay, I'm going to leave all this in. This is me just screwing up. So what does useReducer actually receive? Well, if I waited for this nice little thing to pop up, it receives the actual reducer as its first argument. So reducer, this function above, and then now our initial state. All right, hope I didn't screw up your evening too much. Let's keep going. It's working again, awesome. But we aren't yet tying into this ability to change the values of our state by dispatching new actions to our reducer. So down here where we have these sort of dummy functions, we can tie it in with dispatch. So what we'll do is we'll call dispatch, and dispatch receives an action, and the action has I think it's called type, right? Action.type, yep. So what's the type of set rating? It's actions.setRating, and we need to pass a value for what the new rating should be. So the way this reducer was set up is that it will receive something on the action called value. So we would need to pass in a value that will be passed to the set rating function when it's called. So when called, it will receive the value, which will dispatch an action of set rating type along with that value. And you can see how that works by, say I go down to where it's rendering out all the different stars. So stars live within a button, and when you click on the button, it will call this set rating function with whatever number of star that you're clicking on. So let's just see if this works before we build out all of them. It should allow me to click these stars and change its value. And every time you change the state, it triggers a re-render, so it renders out the proper results. So let's just finish tying this in. I'm going to do some old copy and pasting to make it quicker. So for set price, we will dispatch the set price type, and we need a value. For reset, there's no value, but we do want to dispatch like that, and we will dispatch the reset type, and we don't have a value there. Okay, so let's just see if it's working, and then we'll review what we actually did. So we can click these different filters, change the money bags, and reset them back to the original state. So now we have the exact same functionality that we did have with the Redux version of this without using any additional packages. And it's around the same, it's actually a little bit longer, but what is this one? How many lines of code is Redux? 134, so it's like 5 lines longer. But I think it's a little bit simpler, and you can even see that it's simpler if we go into the React tools. All right, I'm in incognito, so I don't have it. Let's create a new window here, just because I wanted to show this. So if we go into the React tools, here you can see the 2 different versions. So the version context has that provider that we created, and it contains our context that we created, and then our 2 child components, filters and results. Compare that to the Redux version that's a few levels deeper because we needed to use this connect, which wraps the provide. You can just see it's like 3 or 4 levels, additional levels than we have with our hooks plain React version. So thumbs up from me. So we come back here and let's just review what we actually did. So if we go to the top of our context version that we made, we had our initial state. What should the state be when this thing just kicks off? It's an object that contains all of the actions that can basically be sent to the reducer or what the reducer is prepared to handle. So our reducer has a switch statement where based on the incoming action type, it will take our previous version of the state, modify it, and return a new version of that. So the actual component that we exported from this big file, what it did is it wrapped a provider around toChildren components. And what the provider did, this is sort of where most of the logic happened. Its main job was basically to provide state and functions that will dispatch actions to the reducer to any level of child below the provider. So it could be 10 levels deep, it doesn't really matter. But if we look at this, we start off by grabbing our state and the dispatch function using the useReducer hook. And I messed this up, but it receives the reducer itself and the initial state. In here, our job is basically to produce this value, the context value that can be accessed by any children. So in here we had our two state values, rating and price, along with 3 different functions that can be called. And we made them available to the children by taking our context that we created up here, passing the value to this, to the context provider, and having it wrap around the children. So that allowed our toChildren components, filters, and results to access all of this data from the context and then do with it what it needed to do. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Bye.